Hi guys, welcome to Cashcroft TV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on ancient Greek and Roman history. Today we'll be doing Phocion and Cato the Younger. So without further ado, let's begin. So Phocion, as Plutarch kind of notes, he kind of came into a time that was not quite optimal to be a leader, in that they were just coming out of the Peloponnesian War, and in the latter part of his life he faces the enemies of Philip II and Alexander the Great. So on both ends of his reign as a leader, it was quite difficult for him, and that should be quite commemorated. So he was born actually from quite a very poor family. His father was a turner, like a wood turner, so in no ways a wealthy or powerful person in Rome. But despite this, he sort of starts proving himself, and he actually ends up attaining one of the best educations in all of Greece at the time. He was in Plato's academy, and later he was also a student of Xenophanes. He was very frugal growing up and throughout his whole life. It was said that he never wore a coat in battle, so the other soldiers would kind of joke that if Phocion would be wearing a coat that winter, it meant it would be a very cold winter. Similarly, he ate very little, and also, most notably about his speaking style, he spoke very little too. He was very precise with his language. And it's kind of, I guess it kind of leads into Zeno's philosophy, Stoicism. Actually, our next character we'll be talking about, Cato, was directly a Stoic, but Plutarch notes the quote, he never spoke until his arguments were fully formed, and that was quite representative of his character. He also notes that he was kind of like a small coin of greatest value. So he wasn't the best speaker in all of Greece at the time. Technically, that was Demosthenes was the best orator. However, Plutarch notes that Phocion was the most powerful orator, so more precise, and Demosthenes considered Phocion the cutter of his speech, so made it more precise essentially. And Plutarch, I like this quote, he says, "A nod from a person who is esteemed is of more force than 1,000 arguments of or studied sentences from others." So it's just kind of indicative both of Phocion's place in society and precision in speech. So although he is very well educated, he sort of starts his political career. He ultimately becomes the longest reigning strategos or general of Athens ever in history. But he sort of gets taken under the wing of this guy named Chabrias. And Chabrias was very aggressive and quick-tempered, so it's said that it was kind of a mutual relationship between Phocion and Chabrias, because Chabrias sort of exposed him to war and sort of got him a little bit better at getting involved with certain wars. However, he sort of tamed Chabrias and sort of made it more mellow, because Phocion was a lot more relaxed and a lot more temperate. So one of the first battles that he gets involved in is the Battle of Naxos, which was one of the battles following the Peloponnesian War and the Boeotian War. It was a naval battle, and Phocion proves himself to be quite successful. And ultimately that's really what starts his long, drawn-out career in military endeavors. At home, he had a very humble abode, I guess would be the best way of describing it. He ate only the most simple breads, and he even drew his own water. So despite becoming a general and even standing at the assemblies, he would draw his own water, which was something that was commonly done by slaves. His first wife was also quite moderate as well. She just made clay statues, and his second wife was obscure, and it said and humble, that her greatest achievement in life was marrying Phocion. So in that, he was obviously not marrying for political means. It was kind of strange in the assembly. It was said that he always took the counter argument against other people, but other people never took the counter argument against him. So perhaps that was kind of indicative of him always being right. At one point, the Oracle of Delphi comes to Athens and says that there will be one individual here who will disagree with everyone that will unite everyone. And Phocion puts up his hand and says, "I'm the one who disagrees with everything." And everyone applauds and cheers, and he says, "Have I unwittingly said something vile?" So he kind of jokes it off, but he kind of gave him a divine reason to be their leader and kind of justified his tough stance that he always took. One of my favorite quotes that he has is, I have written down here: "You can compel me to act against my wishes, but you shall never force me to speak against my judgment." So I kind of think that this one's sort of like one of my favorite Voltaire quotes. You might not like what I say, but I will fight with my right for... Oh, I disagree with what you say, but I will fight with my right for your right to say it. So basically what he says here is that he will... his right to speak is inalienable, and that's something that was probably a little bit quite forward-thinking at the time. Nowadays we consider all freedom of speech, pretty much unrestricted freedom of speech, fully an unalienable right. So with that, one of the main reforms that he pushed throughout his whole career was, formerly in Athens, they had consolidated both their the politicians controlled the army, but post the Peloponnesian War and coming into the Boeotian War, they had generals who were in charge of the army and politicians who were in charge of public affairs. And he saw this as something to be worried about and saw a lack of synergies. And I think it showed a lot of forethought, because looking at ancient Rome, one of the problems that happened there was that the military got separated from the consul, so or from the Senate, and allowed them to ultimately overthrow them. So I think there was a lot of forethought by Phocion. This other quote that I have here, I guess, while we're on the slide: "My frown never yet made any of you sad, but these jolly men give you plenty of sorrow." So it was said that he never smiled; he always had a frown. He never smiled, but never cried. And what he's saying here is that although he never smiles, the fact that he never upsets people is more important. So not the positive, but more importantly, not the negative. So yeah, another quote, I guess it's not here, is: "You seem to be thinking of something, Phocion." An individual asked, and he said, "Yes, I'm considering whether I can shorten the speech I'm going to make." So he was always aiming for precision, and even, like I would say, it's frugality in speech, which also extended into his personal life. And then, so he becomes actually strategos 45 times, which is the record of any Athenian in history, which is kind of strange, because he was, I would not say the best general, but he just seemed to keep satisfying people. During Thebes, originally he started fighting against Philip II. However, Philip II was the father of Alexander the Great, but he manages to win his affection, and Philip even offers him large sums of money on many occasions, but he rejects them. Following that, when Alexander becomes king, he really pushes the Athenians not to fight too irrationally against Alexander the Great. This is where he starts to sort of fall out of favor, because many people think he's not loyal to Athenians, but maybe loyal to the Macedonians, such as Alexander. But I think it's because he realized they would have just been destroyed at that point. So ultimately, they become subjugated by their state. But in the power struggle following Alexander the Great's death, there's an individual called Antipater who proves to be one of the worst tyrants of all time. So after Alexander the Great died, there was a big sort of power vacuum, and there was a lot of fighting over it. So firstly, Antipater comes in, and Phocion on many occasions opposes Antipater, but since he let the state get subjugated by Antipater, a lot of the Athenians start getting pretty upset with him. Following Antipater's death, he has two sons. Cassander was most likely to get the throne, and there was another individual called Polyarchon, and he supported Cassander because he technically had the birthright to the throne. But Polyperchon ends up winning, and he captures Phocion, and he unfortunately is put on trial, and Polyperchon is very difficult and doesn't let him speak. So Phocion just supposedly puts his staff down and refuses to speak altogether, and he is thus sent to death. One of the most tragic deaths I can think of, they gave him poison, the hemlock, to drink, but they gave him too small of a dosage, so he didn't die. and then they charged him 15 drachmas to pay for a more lethal dose, and he had no money, so one of his friends fortunately bailed him out and had helped him finance that potion. He wasn't even given a burial. He wasn't allowed to be cremated. Polyperchon was pretty harsh in that regards. But later, Cassander ultimately wins the throne and takes back and allows him to get a proper burial. But here are two pretty, I think, quite beautiful images by Poussin of his cremation and his funeral, respectively. And yeah, it just kind of shows that despite he had a very cruel last few years of his life, despite living well past 80, he had a pretty harsh way ending, but he is still remembered in art and remembered positively amongst his state. So yeah, I guess we'll talk more about him in the comparison, but let's move to Cato the Elder. So as you know, if you had seen the previous video, we talked about Cato. Sorry, this is Cato the Younger. We spoke about Cato the Elder. So this is his great grandson. So this obviously would have awarded him a lot of fame and notoriety in Rome. However, both his parents died when he was very young, so he was an orphan, and he was living with his uncle, with his sister Capio, who is his brother Capio, who is his best friend, Portia, his sister, and his two half-sisters, Servilia Major and Servilia Minor. But despite this, even then, his adopted father died at the age of 4, so he was very, very sort of up in the air at that point. But despite this, his uncle Livius Drasus was a powerful and had great temperance, and he was a great orator. So he learned a lot of lessons through him. At one point, Livius Drasus, his uncle, had a friend over, and this is kind of one of the anecdotes that Plutarch includes in reference to his character. His friend comes and speaks to the children sort of as a joke, "Will you support my cause?" And his brother Capio just says, "Yes, I'll support the cause," because he admires the guy. But Cato, not knowing what the cause is, kind of refuses and doesn't speak. This man even holds him out the window, and he still refuses to speak. But ultimately ends up winning the admiration of both him and his uncle for his stubbornness. Another famous anecdote of his childhood was he was playing with a bunch of children, and they had an unfair trial. The children made up their own trial, and he refused to respect the laws of that, and even got violent with the other children. But despite this, he was very popular. At one point, Sylla was hosting a sacred horseback game called Troy. I imagine it's like Homer's Troy, sort of a reenactment of the battle. But amongst the Roman children, they choose 2 who are probably the most famous children of the time to represent the sort of the leading characters in the reenactment. So one of them is obviously given to a very famous individual. However, the second, he actually contests, and he actually manages to win. And he does this partially by winning Sylla's respect. So that was a great achievement very early on. But even this, so he had this teacher named Sarpedon, who was very, very helpful to him, but he also allowed him great many opportunities. So at one point, Cato the Younger was allowed to go to Sylla's house because firstly Sylla requested him, and also Sarpedon had quite a bit of political pull. So he went to the house and he saw that Sylla was doing a lot of massacres because it was his reign of terror at the time. And Cato asks Sarpedon, why does nobody kill Sylla? Because Sylla is causing so much bloodshed. And Sarpedon responds, some men are more afraid of him than they are afraid of death. And he essentially said that, give me a sword and I'll do it. And that's sort of indicative of his character. Sarpedon was worried because, to kill Sylla, the most powerful and most ruthless guy in the world, would be quite violent. But despite this, Sylla never gets upset with him. And, well, I guess maybe he never shows it to Sylla, but Sylla always had his kind of support and kind of appreciated his childhood and upbringing. So, yeah, eventually he gets this large inheritance from his family because they were quite powerful, largely because of the legacy of Cato the Elder. But he uses his inheritance largely to finance his studying of Stoicism. So if you don't know, Stoicism is sort of like putting virtue above all pleasures. So in this regard, Cato the Younger ended up being very similar to Phocion. He was very frugal. He was very temperate. It said similar to Phocion, he never smiled, and it was very difficult to anger him. But it said when he got angry, it was very difficult to placate him. So he was very, very rigid in that regard. But it said he ate only when necessary, so he ate very little, and he drank only the cheapest wine. However, it is noted that he did drink quite a fair portion of wine, so maybe not perfect in that regard. But he was at one point engaged with this one woman, and she ends up marrying another guy, and he gets very upset and he sues them. So I think this is sort of an interesting anecdote in terms of his character, that even in personal life and in personal occasions like this, he uses the law and government to his advantage. But so his brother had said at one time, they asked him, who is your favorite individual, your best friend? And he said Capio. And they asked him, who is your second favorite? And he said Capio. And third, Capio. So he would always respond Capio, and he said he spent all his time with Capio, his brother. It said that Capio was pretty frugal as well. However, when Capio was asked, how frugal are you? He said, compared to most individuals, very frugal, but compared to Cato, he is nothing. So he did wear like perfume and stuff, something Cato would never do. So his first sort of involvement in military was he supported Capio, who was a general in the Spartacus War, which was led by Crassus. So he got his first involvement there, and he proved decently well. So ultimately, he gets to become tribune in Macedon. While there, he proved a man of the soldiers. He lived at the front lines. It said he always was the first in, last one out, always fighting, and he learned to brave the elements. So he would live in the cold. He would wear very little clothes. It's kind of similar to Phocion, and tried to get as pretty much strong as possible. It's probably largely to do with his stoicism belief system, and the legionnaires came to really support him for that. Ultimately, he becomes quaestor, and which is kind of like a finance role, and he's very harsh on Sylla and Pompey's government and their expenditures. And even after he leaves the role of quaestor, he's still always checking the checkbooks of other politicians. So it is said that, or at least when he was learning with Serpedon, Cato was he wasn't the quickest learner. He was actually slow, but he had an amazing memory. So Plutarch sort of notes that it's kind of like the ideas got burned into his head, or what's it called? Yeah, burned into his head, or deeply ingrained, because those who learn slower forget harder, or it's more difficult for them to forget. So I think that's interesting of Cato's character. But yeah, so similar with Quaestor, even after he left the role, he still retained that interest. And despite being so harsh on Sylla and Pompey, he ultimately ends up becoming, when he becomes a senator, he aligns himself with the Optimates, which is kind of like the oligarch class. You can think of it as the conservatives, or the Republicans, the more right-wing party, which is strange because he was so frugal, and he was always very an individual with the soldiers. And a Stoic is more likely to be, I would say, left-wing as opposed to right-wing. But perhaps this was partially because he was an opponent of Julius Caesar, and this is probably what he's most known for, being an opponent of Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar was a populist, so more left-wing, more for the people, more democratic as well, if you're comparing it to ancient Greece. So either way, he opposes Sylla in that regards. At one point there's this rebellion, the Catathelian rebellion, and there's many people. There's sort of an uprising in Rome, and Julius Caesar says we don't need to kill these people, we should just disperse them amongst the cities. But Cicero, one of Caesar's opponents and Cato's ally, says they should kill all the individuals, and Cato sides with Cicero in this regards, partially maybe because he didn't like Caesar, or for various other reasons, but they kill all the people of the uprising. So kind of interesting, because I think everyone considers Caesar as kind of the most violent and most ruthless, but in many ways his opponents were just as violent and ruthless. At one point, when after Caesar had a great achievement, he wanted to do a triumph as Pompey did 3 times, but Cato the Younger filibusters, which is to speak continuously to prevent other legislation to occur. So ultimately, Caesar had to choose whether or not he could triumph, which would be enter the city with a big festival, or become consul. So he chose consul, and Cato sort of suppressed some of his success here, but I think Caesar chose the right decision here. He eventually tension really starts building up between Caesar and Pompey, and he starts opposing some of the optimate practices because he thinks that Caesar's starting to get quite dangerous, but he prevents legal immunity for Caesar to enter back into Rome. So this was probably a very bad decision, because this is what caused, since Julius Caesar pretty much had no other option, because he would be entering as a criminal into Rome anyways. He crosses the Rubicon with the 13th Legion and ultimately becomes dictator and ultimately collapses the Roman Republic and establishes the Roman Empire. Eventually with this, he decides that he would rather die than to serve Caesar, serve under his state, or serve him personally or as a slave. So he stabs himself. Plutarch notes his children and doctor ran into the room after they saw him dying, and the physician tried to save him. But what he did was he opened up his wounds even harsher, so he forced himself to die. So kind of like I see a parallel to Phocion, and Phocion really wanted to get that last little bit of poison and finish the job. And I thought of this quote quite a few times because it's difficult to unpack. Cato, I grudge you your death as you would have grudged me the preservation of your life. So basically what he's saying is that Caesar had the right to preserve his life sort of as respect, but Cato killing himself was a sign of disrespect to Caesar. But despite this, Caesar doesn't harm any of his children. It does no harm to his family, and is generally quite temperate in that regards. Throughout history, Caesar actually forgives pretty much all of his opponents except for Cato. And Cato's supporters later remember that, and Cato ultimately becomes sort of a symbol of anti-Caesar beliefs and anti-Caesarian ideologies. So kind of moving on to, I guess, his ultimate his ultimate legacy was that he was sort of a symbol of republicanism, as we discussed, a symbol of stoicism as well, probably the most famous Stoic of the time after Zeno, who essentially started Stoicism, also the anti-Caesar ideology, but also, prudence in speech, as we saw with Phocion. So I will begin to speak when I'm not going to say what we're better off unsaid. So he did not just open his mouth for the sake of opening his mouth. He was more prudent, similar to Phocion. And kind of echoing the quote of Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, we have 2 ears and one mouth, so we should listen more than we say. So that's sort of very indicative of his character. A cool note is that he actually appears in Dante's Divine Comedy, and he is one who is not necessarily going to heaven, but he is one who is going to get some sort of special treatment. So I think, or my understanding, Divine Comedy is a very difficult book to read, but I think it is that he was, despite his suicide, or I think this is what Dante is alluding to, despite his suicide, he was still moral, and perhaps maybe his suicide was justified, and that's why there was a special circumstance in that regard. So as for the comparison, I would say they're both extremely frugal and temperate, as I've kind of banged out and mentioned many, many times throughout this video, but it's true. They both actually came up through tough times. So Phocion came out when they were just after the Peloponnesian War, so they were being suppressed by Sparta, and he also had very difficult adversaries, Philip II and Alexander the Great, who was probably the greatest of all time. Cato the Younger lived throughout the Civil War, but in terms of contrast here, I think Phocion came from a much more difficult upbringing. Despite Cato the Younger being an orphan and having to move household to household, at least he had brothers and sisters and a very famous grandfather whom he shared the same name with. Whereas Phocion was simply, his father was a turner, a wood turner, came from absolute austerity and climbed to, I would say, the same relative level of success as Cato the Younger. So I guess that's marginally a +1 of Phocion there. Both of their deaths were pretty interesting. They both died through suicide, and in both cases, I think, kind of echoing Dante's philosophy here, suicide is obviously in many cultures considered wrong, but in some cases it's justified, and in these two cases it's justified. And I think this also echoes Socrates, who died for the sake of his beliefs, and he didn't even have to. He chose that his legacy would have been more valuable if he died. And I think that's what both Phocion and Cato the Younger were striving for. Interestingly enough, they both align themselves with the optimates and oligarchs, despite being so frugal themselves. So optimates and oligarchs that we mentioned were the more conservative, more right-wing ideologies. I think that's just interesting that they ultimately aligned themselves with the optimates. I think one of the other individuals is similar in that they maybe run or in public life pursue the opposite end of the spectrum that they actually inherently are, as to win both sides of the political spectrum. So I think that could have been potentially what they were going for here. I suppose the very last criticism, and Plutarch always knows, is that who was the better general? Well, I think Phocion was strategized 45 times, and despite him not having any extreme, amazing, noteworthy successes, just being strategized for 45 times is an incredible feat. Whereas Cato the Younger, he supported his brother as in the Spartacus War of Spartacus, but that was in no ways that great of success. They were fighting a bunch of slaves, albeit well-trained slaves, but he was, I would say, the lesser general in this regard. So, yeah, I think that's everything for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you watch the next one. Thanks so much.